Welcome to PWS United, a podcast for the Prader-Willi syndrome community, brought to you by PWSA USA. This podcast gives the latest news in research, advocacy, and family support by bringing together staff, volunteers, PWS treatment specialists, biotech and pharmaceutical representatives, caregivers, family members, and individuals with PWS. Our goal is to share education, awareness, and resources with those living with PWS and their supporters. Join us in our mission to enhance the quality of life and empower those affected by Prader-Willi syndrome.
PWSA USA CEO Stacy Ward sat down with educator and IEP coach Jamilah Bashir to discuss special education and the state of the Department of Ed. They discussed training for special education teachers, the voucher program, where to find good information about changing policies and decisions within the Department of Education, and the path of an executive order. Jamilah clarified the different roles of the U.S. Department of Ed versus the state's Department of Ed, focusing on funding and the accountability of states to provide services. This discussion can provide clear insight on the role of the U.S. Department of Education, why it may be critical for our loved ones with PWS, what the alternative may look like, i.e. voucher programs in private schools, and how and why to contact your representatives on these issues. Jamilah Bashir has over 20 years' experience serving as a special education teacher, special education supervisor, and education consultant across charter, public, and private schools. She is also the sibling to an individual with a disability. She has 2 master's degrees, one in education and another in educational leadership from St. Joseph's University, and is the founder of the IEP Coach LLC, a company dedicated to empowering special education teachers, schools, and parents. Jamilah is a speaker and thought leader and has presented at conferences such as the 2024 Autism and Black Conference and spoken on podcasts like The Impact of Educational Leadership with Isaiah Drone and The Opportunity Gap by Understood.org. She is the author of Because of Her, a memoir about her experience of growing up with a sibling with a disability. She created resources and programs like the Master the IEP course and Speducators Rise. Jamilah connects with over 7,000 people weekly through her live series, The Coaching Corner with the IEP Coach, on social media. In the show notes, you will find links to Jamilah's website, her Master the IEP course, the Speducators Rise coaching program, some freebies, and her social media accounts. We'd like to extend a huge thank you to Jamilah for sharing her knowledge of the special education system, and we hope this episode helps families better understand the current landscape of the Department of Education. Now let's get into it.
I am Jamilah Bashir, aka the IEP Coach. I'm the founder and CEO of the IEP Coach LLC. We are an education consulting company, and we specialize in providing professional development and coaching to special education teams, teachers, and paraprofessionals so they can thrive in their roles and not just surviving. I'm a former special education teacher. I was in a classroom a little over 14 years, and I'm a former special education supervisor. So I'm really passionate about special education, and the reason for that is I have a younger sister who has an intellectual disability, which is why I'm so passionate about it, and just supporting, just making sure, like for me, the reason I became a sped teacher is I'm like, well, she needs quality educators of color. She needs to see people that look like her. Even though I never wanted to be a teacher ever in my life, I never thought I would do it. I did not want to do it, but that just was the trajectory of my life. And I really loved the work. And as I became a SPED supervisor, I want to say that's when I learned that I was an advocate at the same time, because I never viewed myself as an advocate. Yeah, so that has been the work. And I decided to focus on special education teachers because I'm a former special education teacher, and I can count on my one hand how many times I received training tailored to what I was doing as a teacher. And it wasn't a lot. And that's a shame for me to say, oh, I was in a classroom for 14 years, but I can count on one hand, how many trainings tailored to special education. And I'm like, this is why schools get in litigation, because you don't know how to write IEPs. You don't know how to lead IEP meetings. No one is showing you how to do it. It's trial and error unless they have perhaps a coach, a teacher coach who can help you, or they actually have a coach in the districts. And sometimes they're stretched thin. They really can't support you. So I didn't want teachers having to go through just a trial and error of what I went through, because you can get in lawsuits that way. Um, and
And do.
right, and they do. And also for schools and districts and networks to understand, just because I have my certification in special education, that doesn't mean I know how to write an IEP. You don't learn that in college. You don't learn how to write an IEP. You're allowed to see one. Of course, they cover up all the information,
Right.
but you don't know how to write one. You don't know how to lead meetings. You don't do progress. It's like all of that stuff you learn on the job. And I think administrators and those higher up in the district and networks, they don't realize that. So it's like when they hire a sped teacher, it's like, oh, here's your caseload. Go write those IEPs, and it's like, well, wait, I'm a teacher and I got to do IEPs. I'm a teacher and I'm a case manager. That's a lot to take on. And that's why you get so many who leave the profession, because it's too much and there is no support, and they don't really know the background, so they can't help you. And then all of the seasoned, because I don't like saying old, all of the seasoned SPED teachers, they have retired or are on their way out of retirement. And luckily for me, I was able to work with teachers like that. So I learned a lot from them. They learned from me. But it's like new teachers coming in. No one's telling you all of this. No one's holding your hand. No one's going to do this meeting with you. No one is going to prepare. No, it's none of that. So that's why at the IEP coach, I was like, okay, we need to focus on this. And then even when it comes to SPED leadership, the things you have to do as a SPED leader, like, hey, you have billing you have to do. Do you know how to do that?
Most of the time they don't.
And you can leave so much money on the table. Your school could be leaving so much money on the table because you failed to do one part. You failed to document one simple thing. And it's like, now, wait, you're missing money. So it's like there's so much that goes on and that people don't really realize. And then also, as a special about your role in MTSS, making sure you follow the process, and it's not just, oh, this kid needs special ed. It's like, no, you need to track that for 6 weeks at least, and you need to submit a tier 2 nomination, and then we'll decide as a team if that is the best thing, making sure we're not skipping stuff, because this is how children get misdiagnosed, and this is how children get into special education when they don't need to be in special education. So that is just a little bit about us. We self-published a book in 2018 called Because of Her. And it's the truth. It is basically a true story of what it was like growing up with my younger sister, because you always hear from parents, you don't hear the siblings' perspective. And we are impacted just as much, because a lot of times your mom or dad is like, oh, take so-and-so with you, help your brother with this, do this for your sister, and da-da-da. And you feel like a surrogate parent, so to speak, and you don't feel like a sibling anymore. So I just speak to that experience, what it was like growing up, and then the impact she's had on my life. And that is how I met Anne, through social media. And we've just been following each other since. And there was so much talk about the dismantling of the Department of Education. And I just saw so many reels, and I was like, I was talking to my virtual assistant. I'm like, I think I'm going to do a reel, because I was just like, I want people to have clear information so they don't assume anything, and understand what is happening and not fall victim to what you see in the media and what you hear people say. So we did a reel on that. It was so many people like, oh my God, thank you so much for this. So then we did one on vouchers, and I broke that down. What does that mean? Let's
That's
break that down. Right.
It is so, so important. First of all, the work that you're doing is incredible. And in my personal experience, working with teachers who have devoted their careers to special education, they all want to do well. They want to do the right things. They want their students to succeed. They're just not necessarily given the tools, the
Mhm.
education, and the training, like you mentioned.
Right.
So I think that piece of it is so important. And you're one of the few people I know who are focusing on that. There's a lot of people out there focusing on it from the parent side, but not as
Mhm.
many focusing on how do we support the teachers as
Yeah, and
well.
at first, I was on the parent side, because I was just like, "Hey, you need me to review some documents." "Hey, you want to answer some questions? You can pay to pick my brain for 30 minutes." It was something like that. But then as I got a coach, I'm just like, well, if I focus on teachers, it's like, okay, if I help you understand how to write better IEPs, this can possibly help you stay out of litigation and then also help you lead IEP meetings, how you should do them, the time you should allot for them. This can help as well. Not saying that it is the 100% proof answer, but this can help so much more when you do have the training and I'm not far removed from you where it's like I cannot relate to you. I don't know what you're talking. No, I'm new to I'm not new to this. I've been in this, okay? I understand that the burnout is real. I understand how, yes, you can end up in a hospital. And wanna know why? Because I was in the hospital. I had to go to the emergency room because just it was stress-related things happening to me, and I'm just like, "Okay, well, I can't continue to work like this." I changed my work environment. I had to switch districts because 'cause I'm like, "Hey," even though I truly feel I love that district and I learned so much, but I'm like, I don't want to be stagnant. I want to grow in this. And I'm like, this is affecting my health. So I have to go somewhere else. Went somewhere else. It was great. But then it was okay. We're constantly cleaning up other teachers' mess. Uh, there needs to be a conversation with that grade of teachers because it's every year. You know what the issue is. Somebody needs to say something. And I'm like, I don't want to get fired. So perhaps I don't want to get fired for saying something. So hey, I got to move up in the grades or I have to step out of this role to do something else. And that's when I stepped out to be a sped supervisor because I'm just like, yeah, you know what the issue is, but you're not saying anything. And yeah, it's stressing me and my team out.
Yeah.
So, it's
Supervisors is important.
yeah, and because and I've always wanted to learn the other side. And I have to say, it was a blessing when I did become a supervisor. I wound up relocating to Brooklyn, and there was just some things that I found out of how things were being maneuvered with IEPs. And I'm like, this is why we have so many students who are who are misdiagnosed,
Yes.
from just I'll just say not very honest practices.
Mhm.
And I'll just say that. And parents had no idea about it. And I'm just like, okay, so this is why you set it up this way. This is why I can't do certain things. I'm like, okay, I understand because that was being abused. Okay, got it. But I was just like, dag, how many students was affected by this because people wanted to just go behind the parent and change things that wasn't discussed at a meeting. And then the parent is wondering, well, what happened? I don't remember that being discussed. And then perhaps being gaslighted, like, oh, you sure? And it's like, they did, and you did this behind their back. And so being able to just be that voice for parents. There were some parents like, listen, I don't feel like my son has this type of disability. How can we go about, how do we fix this? And then, being that advocate to show them, tell them, and show them, okay, this is what we have to do. This is what I need you to do. This is what we're going to do. And, having them follow through, having to advocate for them. Like, we had to get a reevaluation for a student. Of course, get a reevaluation, you think, if they're misdiagnosed. And I had a psychologist push back on me like 3 times.
Oh, wow.
3 times.
A district psychologist or,
District psychologist
okay.
3 times. And I'm just like, "We can do this all day because I'm not backing down, like, we're gonna do this. You can say whatever you want," but I always led from a place of data and best practice, and I'm like, "Well, best practice is if a student is being exited or you have data to prove that they are not representative of the disability that they have, you're supposed to do a reevaluation with new testing."
Yes.
A psychologist that I used to work with told me that. And
Right.
I'm just like, "Okay, we can do this all day.
And,
You're wasting time."
I was gonna say, did you find that some of the pushback was about the time? And the workload versus that particular student, because
Yes,
that's
I
where I
think
see it.
it was the time and the workload, and I wanna say me and this particular psychologist, I would say we would go back and forth, not in a disrespectful manner, because I respected her and she respected me. We had a mutual respect for each other, but the thing is, it wasn't a lot of her. There wasn't enough psychologists
Yes.
to share her load, so you're putting more work on her to do this. Of course, she's trying to be like, "Wait, is there another way?" But I'm like, "That makes no sense. No." We have to do this. And I'm like, and then at the same time, I think she knew that, okay, well, Miss Bashir is going to give me everything I need. She never is like loosey goosey with her paperwork and don't do things on time. I always keep her updated about everything. So she's never walking into a surprise or anything. But I think it was the time and the work because it wasn't enough psychologists. And I
Mhm.
totally understand that because it's just like there's not enough sped teachers
Right.
who I wanna say no SPED. There's not
Correct.
enough SPED directors who know SPED, or they're on their way out. And it could
Yeah.
be that you're tired, so you're starting to be like, "Listen, okay, that can just go. I'm just gonna" because 'cause you're on your way out.
Somebody else will do it.
Somebody else will do it.
Yeah. That brings up one of the questions I was hoping we could talk about is there's with the proposed cuts to the Department
Mhm.
of Education or the dismantling of the US Department of Education, there's some concerns about what that will mean in
It
terms
is.
of teachers. Can you start by telling us what the US Department of Education does and how that differs from state Department of Education?
Sure. So the US Department of Education, they uphold the civil rights of our students and make sure they're like the accountability for states to make sure states are providing free, appropriate public education, that they are upholding the civil rights of all our students. They give federal funds to the states. So, you have Title One. I know you heard of Title One funding. So
Sure.
that with Title One funding, hey, you need additional reading interventions. You may need to get a reading specialist. You can use that money, Title One money, for your school to purchase that. They provide money for those less, I don't want to say less fortunate, but I'll say more vulnerable populations, whether it's the suburban, urban, the rural areas. They provide funding for them, programming for them. So it could be after school programs. They provide that. And a lot of the title money Title One you can use for schools. You have Title Two money. You use that for training for your administration, training for teachers. There's even money in that title with Title Two for parent workshops. Title Three, that's specifically for English language learners. Like, what do they need? What do they provide? So there's so much, I want to say, funding that the U.S. Department of Education provides to the states, but ultimately they're like the accountability for the states to do what they're supposed to do. So, like, even when it comes to colleges and universities, there are certain things they have to uphold too because they get funding. I think, what school is it? Columbia. They
Yeah.
just got money cut because of what's happening with their Jewish students. So, like, that is the accountability the U.S. Department of Education has. It's like, oh, you want to continue to discriminate against these students? Well, we're going to cut that funding. So it's the accountability. That's just an example. Hey, you're not upholding the civil rights of these students, so we're gonna cut that funding, and that's a lot of funding that got cut.
It is, and I think it's important to note that although there is a lot of funding that does come from the federal US Department of Education, not all of the funding comes.
Yeah,
There's
not all
also
of it.
this misconception that either public schools are funded solely by the state or solely by the federal
Right,
government, and the reality is
right.
it's a combination.
And it varies too by your state because some states are heavily reliant on funds from the US Department of Education, whereas some other states are not. And that was something I shared in there real like I showed like a visual so you can see. Also, when it comes to your state Department of Education, I want to say the US Department of Education is clear on how special education should be upheld, how it's supposed to be, how you need to service students, how you need to provide training for teachers, etc. Now, your state's interpretation of that is different.
Yeah.
Again, the US Department of Education holds your state accountable to make sure, hey, you're doing it the way we say it's supposed to be done. Now, if the US Department of Education goes away, your state's interpretation of FAPE of least restrictive environment, it's going to be their interpretation of it.
Yes.
Now, that could be detrimental for many states, especially those who may not have the best special education services. And I want to say sometimes there's a lot of southern states don't have the best special education services. So it's like, wait, it's like, hey, my fate looks like this, and yours look completely different.
Yeah, I
And that's the
anticipate.
scary part, I'll say, for parents because it's like, well, hey, I know if my school isn't doing whatever, I could go to the state. And if the state is not doing what it's supposed to, I know I could go to the U.S. Department of Education because it's very clear how the services my child is supposed to receive. Now, with that accountability gone, it's like, well, what will happen if my student isn't being provided what they're supposed to get? And they're just like, well, hey, we got a classroom for you. And it's like, well, that's not enough. So
Mhm.
that I want to say that is the scary part because it's like you don't know.
Right. And that's what we're hearing a lot in the community is one, the fear of the unknown. And then there was also a misperception that all of this funding has already been cut. So,
Mhm.
helping people understand that IDEA is funded through this school
Mhm.
year.
Right.
It is currently not funded for the next.
Right.
But at least through this school year, we're okay right now.
Mhm.
And that's where that fear of the unknown comes
Mhm.
in is what will this look like? Who
And right.
will be providing that accountability?
Right. And it's understandable. And the scary part is especially like, hey, you're a parent and you're like, I finally got support for my kid. I finally have people that I feel comfortable and I trust with my kid. And it's like, well, what's going to happen to that? Or what's going to happen to them? Or, there's too much unknown. And my biggest fear was, oh my God, the interruption of, because me being coming from a SPED teacher, I'm like, that could interrupt so much programming, especially if, okay, you know what? It's not the US Department of Education no more. It's, oh, we moved it under the Department of Human Services or something like that. But oh, that's over there. But if you want to talk about funding, hey, the funding, you got to go to the Department of Treasury. It's like everything is not under one umbrella anymore. It's like, okay, funding, you're over there. Okay, SPED, you're going to be over here. And training, hey, you're going to be over. It's like, you're scattering. It's like you put SPED in a thing in a container, you shook it up and you just threw it across the United States, and it's like across all these different departments, and it's like that causes confusion and chaos, and it's like, yes, does the Department of Education need some improvements? Absolutely.
Of course.
It's not perfect. It's
It
not
is not.
perfect. But the thing is there are certain things that work because there's a system. And
Yes.
what's the problem with improving the system? Why would you get rid of the whole thing and not just improve the areas that need to be improved? And it's like I feel like it's always people who aren't in education who will make these decisions, and you don't have that SPED brain, you don't have that educator brain to know like, this could really interrupt a lot of children's programming,
Yes.
or it
Well,
could cut a lot of their programming.
prior to even the establishment of the US Department of Education, the funding, the
Mhm.
accountability, IDEA, prior to being IDEA, was scattered.
Mhm.
And we know the data shows how
Mhm.
detrimental that was
Mhm.
for students who could and should have been receiving special education services and perhaps weren't,
Right.
or it changed. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I agree. There's definitely some improvement needed,
Mhm.
but it is scary to think about what that's going to look like.
Mhm.
How do you think either the U.S. Department of Education or even some funding cuts is going to challenge the State Department of Educations differently?
I think that could put a strain on states and cause them to perhaps increase taxes or have to cut things they already have established. And it could be something important, not saying that this is going to happen, education or health insurance. You know what I mean? It could be something like that. It's like, which one do we need more of? Which one can we cut? And it's like, no, we need both.
Yes.
I feel like it will come to decisions like that, like
Mhm.
like our necessities, or you're literally weighing necessities, and we can't live without either of them. we need both of them. And I'm like, you're actually at the point where, hey, you got to decide to cut one or defund one of them. That's the scary. That's why I feel like states are going to have to come to, and some are going to be stretched thin. Some may not have no room at all because they rely heavily from the US Department of Education. And it's like, well, where is that money going to come from? And then it's just sad with some of these states. I'm like, you're heavily reliant on the US Department of Education. You know, the population you serve. Some people are waking up and realizing, oh, shoot, I looked at this completely different. I didn't really look at this as a whole because sometimes when it's not you who's affected, you're like, oh, okay, it doesn't bother me. But it's like, it could be your neighbor, it could be somebody in your family, it could be a friend. It's like, sometimes people don't think full picture to understand the ramifications of their decisions. And
Mhm.
I think now you have a lot of people like, "Oh my god, I didn't realize this affected me."
And I think that's really an important note. I think that there's many, many people who just are unaware of what the US Department of Education does and how that does support students in your state and at the local level, and what changes could happen by
Mhm.
either the funding cuts or the dismantling. How do you suggest, or where, I should say, do you suggest parents and educators and advocates and administrators go to find the accurate information? Because there is so much misinformation out there right now
Mhm.
about this issue.
Yes, I'm very mindful of where I get the information. Even with some news sources, you got to really look at it. So, like for me, I will go to my state Department of Education to look up things, especially with your politics. Like, who is your state representative? You could call your state rep office. You can get actual information like, listen, what is going on? Even the politicians in your city, contacting them. But for me, like, it's the Department of Education. I'm very mindful of news sources, so, like, looking at the main ones, not like I don't wanna say these rinky dinky. I don't wanna say that, but, like, looking at your legitimate news sources, and I wanna say stay off of social media. Don't use social media as your go-to. For me, if I share anything on a topic, I pull in where I got the information from. So, like, I think I tied in, the teacher I think one of the teacher unions, website. I just tied in, because they had just a nice clear picture of what it is. I
Mhm.
tied into, like, you could see behind me, okay, this is where I got this from. This is for this, what year, like, anytime I share information, I'm not just sharing it from my brain, I will show you too. So you also want that too. Like, hey, where did you get your information from? And not just take people's what they share for face value. You have to do your due diligence and fact check. But again, on social media, everybody has a platform, everybody has a voice. And the thing is, you don't know who's telling the truth and who is not.
Correct, and I think that's where some of the struggle is coming, and that increase in fear is because there's so much misinformation that, in the same day, especially if you're only using social media as your news
Hmm.
source, you're seeing contradictory posts and
Hmm.
rulings that
Right.
have been announced, and that causes an increase in fear, and then also that spread of misinformation and,
Hmm.
the struggle that we're seeing right now.
Right. And I would say, even with that, like, if you happen to go on social media and you're looking, I would say look at all other posts that they have done.
Oh, that's a great point.
See, is this a pattern that they do? Because
Mhm.
if you go on mine, it's all special education stuff. I talk about all sped stuff. The good, the bad, I talk about it all, and if you DM us, we're very responsive, and even when we go live every Tuesday, I tell you that, I'm like, "We're very responsive. Hey, if a question comes to you later, feel free to DM us. Hey, if there's a topic you want us to talk about, send us the topic." We're very transparent, so you want people who are transparent, with information. You can go to our website. You can see my credentials. I'm not lying about what I do. You can see my credentials, and I purposefully did that.
Yeah, that's very
because
important. We're
enough
gonna
people
link your
don't.
website and,
Yeah, because enough people don't do that. It's like, why are you just taking their information and you gave them money? How do you know for sure they have a background and what it is that we did that? We purposefully did that.
I think that's great. Are you aware of or have you had any experience with any alternate models of funding or governance that states could implement if the Department of Education was scaled back or eliminated?
I have not. I just know depending on your state, like I said, you have some states who are heavily reliant on federal funds.
Yes.
And then you have some, they are somewhat reliant, but not heavily like others.
Yeah.
So it really depends on your state. And that's just from like information that I found when I was doing research to do that particular content. Because one, I wanted to make sure that I was absolutely sure what I was saying, that I had proof of what I was saying, but I have not had any experience with, hey, what alternate funding can states use if they don't have the federal funds? Because I know like federal funds that are specifically for special education or specifically for L students, specifically for like you have affirmative action, you have Title IX, all of that. Like I know that money, but it's like as far as your state, that's different.
It is, and I think that that's a little bit of what the fear is right now, is that if those funds are not available and everyone is concerned about taxes and the increase in
Mhm.
taxes, and if those things don't happen and you're left with just your state funding, things
Mhm.
have to be cut. That's a
Yes.
math problem. You have to
Yes.
solve the math problem.
Yes. And
Uh,
yep. And I
and
would definitely recommend, like, contacting, again, your state rep, contacting your governor, contacting your mayor, asking questions. Sometimes, your mayor will have a open forum,
Mhm.
for you to come. It could be your city council having an open forum for you to come and share your concerns. And I would definitely recommend anyone to take advantage of that because, hey, you're getting it straight from the horse's mouth. You're able to get your question out and get an answer or not get an answer.
That's a great point too. We as an organization do a lot of advocacy and spend quite a bit of time in DC advocating primarily until this point for
Mhm.
healthcare legislation and research that's going to positively affect the lives of people with PWS. And we're pivoting a little bit to really look at the education piece and do some advocacy in those areas. So I would encourage people to reach out to both their local and their federal elected officials to encourage them to vote against any cuts or dismantling
Right.
to education.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think it's important that we stress that just because an executive order has occurred does not mean it can be implemented. This is
It
one of
doesn't
those
mean it's
things.
instant.
Right. And it's one of those things that
Yeah.
it's going to be tied up in court for a little while.
Right. Right,
Uh,
right, right. And I think, yeah, when people say executive order, oh my God, that happened right away. And it's
right.
like, no, this is what he wants to do, but it has to go through Congress. So this is why you when we have these primaries, you want to make sure you vote for people who are going to vote for the best interests of their constituents. You want to make sure that, hey, they're voting for what we need and what, is very important to me. And what is it? We have one. What is this? We're in March.
Yes.
Trying to think, when is the next one coming?
We'll have midterms next year, I
Next
believe.
year. Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. 2026. Right, right, right. So you want to make sure, hey, who is on that ballot? Who is going to fight for us?
Right. And they can't fight for us if they don't know what you want.
Exactly.
So that's where it's important to be sure that we are talking to our elected officials and telling them as constituents what is important to us.
And researching them because we don't want yes people.
Correct. Do you think that private organizations or not for profits or community partnerships are going to play a role in filling any gaps in the resources that will be cut if
I
this were to come to fruition?
I feel like they would because one, hey, if this service is cut, parents have to find alternatives.
Hmm.
And then it's like, okay, well, what alternatives are there? So it could be private organizations, it could be nonprofit organizations, it could be for profit organizations who are like, hey, this is what we can do to provide that service for you or provide this support for you. And I know Currently, there's been talk about, oh, this voucher, oh, $10,000. And it's like, well, if you know how vouchers work, no, it's not an instant, here it's $10,000. Go do whatever you want with it. No, it's a possibility. That's like the max you could get up to. That doesn't mean you're getting that money. And most states do a reimbursement thing where, hey, you put up your money and then you could get reimbursed. It may not be all the money you pay, it may be some of that money you paid.
Right.
And so I just want to say, parents, and when I finished my content, I said, please pay attention because, of course, things get dressed up a certain way. Things are shared using certain language to make it sound so good. Like, oh my gosh, you can't do without this. But like, you really have to read in between the lines and think, hey, really, you really giving us that money out of the kindness of your heart to really make sure my child has the proper education that they require? And then you also have to think, okay, if I do go private school route, and not saying private schools are horrible, you have to understand private schools aren't obligated to follow an IEP.
Correct.
Private schools don't have to provide any specialized transportation. Private schools don't have to provide any specialized services. And understand, you would be paying for that. They are not required to provide that at all. And then also, you have to think, well, how much is the tuition for an entire year? Will maybe if you actually got $10,000, would that cover the whole year? Do you have multiple children that are gonna go to the school? It's so much you have to think about, and so we have to pay attention and really understand, well, who is this really benefiting? It's not really benefiting the working class at all. No, it's really benefiting upper class, you know what I mean? Hey, they already can afford that.
Right. Well, in that 10,000 from a voucher perspective, when you think about all of the voting eligible voters in the country, many of them do not have a student who's receiving special education services. So to them, 10,000 seems like a great amount
Mhm.
of money for those families because
Right.
they're unaware of the cost of educating.
Especially if your child requires related services.
Correct.
Speeches are not cheap. Occupational therapy is not cheap. Counseling is not cheap. Physical therapy, none of that is cheap. And when it comes to public education, they can get that through public education. They don't have to come out their pockets for it at all. And
Correct.
so, okay, yes, there is a huge attack on public education. And again, public education isn't perfect. Does it need improvement? Absolutely, like everything else in this United States does.
Yes.
Getting rid of it, is that gonna solve the problem? No, because you're getting rid of it, and what is the alternative? You have no alternative
Correct.
at all. And it's like, okay, you wanna defund it, you wanna make it undesirable.
It's really a lot to think about.
It is, and it's just so much uncertainty. And then sometimes even when there is conversation regarding this, I'm like, "This is so vague. You're not being clear enough or detailed enough to really answer a question. It's like you're talking in circles."
That's a great point. So, because everything is so vague right now, are there pointed questions that you would encourage parents to be asking their elected officials to get answers to?
I would definitely encourage parents to ask specifically the funding question. Excuse me, what is the funding? What will be the alternative if the Department of Education, we no longer get money from the US Department of Education? What is the alternative funding that we will use to replace that funding that we would have? That is like the first question. And then I would even ask, what is your interpretation of IDEA? What is your interpretation of FAPE, free appropriate public education? What is your interpretation of least restrictive environment? And how does that look? And I would ask for examples because they could easily say, oh, that's the, no, show me what that looks like.
Those are
Because
great
I know what
questions.
least restrictive environment is. You know what least restrictive environment is. A free, appropriate public education. What does that look like to you? What does it look like in this state that we are in? You know what I mean? What does that look like in the urban cities? What does that look like in rural? What does that look like in suburb? What does it look like?
That's a really, really great question because I do find I have great relationships with some of my elected officials and their
Mhm.
staffers. But depending on their role as a staffer, their expertise is in something very different than education. V- Great people. They want to listen, they want to learn, but you have to find the right person to educate as well, who's going to be guiding your elected officials in those decisions based on what constituents want. That's a really, really great question. I think we take for granted that everybody knows what we know,
Right.
and they don't.
Mhm. I always tell people, "Don't assume."
Definitely not.
Do not assume. Don't assume.
It has been so lovely talking with you. How can our listeners find you?
Sure. They can go to our website, www.theiepcoachllc.com, and they can follow us on social media. We are at the IEP Coach LLC on all platforms. So Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. We are on YouTube. We're also on LinkedIn. You can find us at the IEP Coach LLC. And also, you can find me, Jamilah F. Bashir, on LinkedIn, and we go live every Tuesday and we talk about all things special education. So tune in. We go live 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time every Tuesday, and then we always will share a post if we're not going live, just to let you guys know. But we talk about all things special education. So if you ever have a topic you would love for us to discuss, you can send us a DM, a message. You can email us, and we'll definitely talk about that topic. So we've talked about the current state of special education. We've talked about co-teaching, gen ed teachers and sped teachers, so we do various topics. So definitely tune in if you can. We always have after we go through our topic, we always have time for Q&A. So even if you don't have a question about what we talked about, you can still ask questions because we get everyone who tunes in, but like some people will ask questions about an IEP meeting, or you get parents asking about, well, this happened, what should I do with this? And now, and sometimes I'll say, DM us because I don't want your business on this live. And I will say, send us a message. I'll definitely message you back. You can definitely get some questions answered.
That's great. And if it's okay with you, I'd love to link all of those things in our show
Sure.
notes so people have access to you. This was great. Thank you so much. I appreciate
Yes.
your time so much. And I'd love to have you back to talk about other education issues as we move forward.
Sure,
I
we
think
would
it's
love
so
to. We
important.
would love to.
That's great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of PWS United. If you want to learn more about Prader-Willi syndrome and how PWSA USA is making strides in advocacy, family support, and research, visit www.pwsausa.org. And while you're there, we encourage you to sign up for our Pulse email newsletter to stay informed about the latest news, resources, and events. Don't forget to subscribe to the PWS United podcast so you never miss an episode. Our team is always available to support families and their loved ones living with PWS 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You can call us at 941-312-0400 or email info@pwsausa.org. Catch a new episode next Tuesday, and until then, have a great week.